When was the last time you had an amazing conversation with someone? What made that experience possible? Could you repeat that experience with someone else? And if so, what would you do? Connecting with others on a deep level is a skill. And my guest today is here to help us develop those skills so that we can have many more amazing conversations, even with complete strangers. This is the 5 a.m. Miracle, episode number 541. Supercommunicators and the Power of Authentic Connection with Charles Duhigg. Good morning and welcome to the 5 a.m. Miracle. I am Jeff Sanders and this is the podcast dedicated to dominating your day before breakfast. My goal is to help you bounce out of bed with enthusiasm, create powerful, lifelong habits, and tackle your grandest goals with extraordinary energy. I am a keynote speaker and corporate trainer, specializing in delivering high-energy, interactive, and action-oriented presentations and workshops focused on productivity, wellness, and personal and professional growth. If you want to learn more about how we can work together, head over to jeffsanders.com/speaking. Now, in the episode this week, I speak with Charles Duhigg. Charles is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of The Power of Habit, Smarter, Faster, Better, and his latest, Supercommunicators. In our conversation, Charles and I discuss what it means to become a super communicator, why communication is a skill that you can improve today, and Charles also presents a challenge for you to get deep with someone in just 3 questions or less. Let's dig in. And welcome back to the 5 a.m. Miracle, and I am here with my amazing guest, Mr. Charles Duhigg, talking about his brand new book. So Charles, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. This is really fun.
Yeah, I've been wanting to have you on the show for a long time, and I should have asked you to be on the show years ago, and I just didn't do it. So I'm very glad we got the chance to connect now. You have a brand new book out, which I just want to get right into. This book is incredible, mostly for one reason for me, which is I have this obsession with communication, and I find that if other people did it better, my life would be easier. And that's mostly how I approach it. But the book called Supercommunicators, How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. Let's just start with a question I have had for years in regarding communication. Why do you think that so many of us struggle with communicating effectively? Are we lacking a framework or a skill set or a natural talent? What's the missing piece here?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And in many ways, the opposite of the question is actually equally astounding, which is, why are we all so good at communication, right? You can meet someone who comes from another country, who has a completely different background, who belongs to a different religion, votes for different kinds of people. You can meet them on the bus and you can still have a conversation with them. And when you think about it, that's actually kind of amazing, right? That we can connect with people from whom we are different. But you're exactly right that there are these moments when we really want to connect with someone and we struggle to do so. We have trouble doing so. And oftentimes it's because we don't understand that communication is a set of skills. And when you learn those skills, and most importantly, when you recognize them as skills, your brain makes them into habits very, very quickly. But we have to practice them a little bit. We have to know what our goal is in a conversation. And then allow our instincts to come out and not get in the way of what our brain does really well, which is communicate.
So I was thinking before, as I was preparing for this interview, that when I was preparing for the interview in the sense that I was thinking of questions that I could ask. I was thinking of ways to frame things. So I'm walking into this with a head start, right? And our average conversation is in the moment. And there's no chance to prepare and have questions in advance. Is this something where you could, to your point, this is a set of skills. We could figure out how to approach an in-the-moment conversation and do it better.
Absolutely. And to give you an example of what a super communicator is, because we're all super communicators at one time or another, let me ask you a kind of question, which is, if you were having a really bad day and you came home and you wanted to call someone up who you know would just make you feel better, just talking to them would be like make your day a better place. Do you know who you would call?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah? Who is it?
My wife.
Your wife, your wife. Okay, so for you, your wife is a super communicator, and you're probably a super communicator back for her.
Hmm.
Now, let me ask, what does your wife do when you call her that causes that sense of pleasure and ease?
I think part of it is that we have a history together, so I feel
Mhm.
comfortable talking to her. And then the kind of more obvious point is that she asks questions about my life because she knows me well,
Yeah.
and those questions are very specific and pointed at where I am, and so it's very personal in that sense.
And my guess is that you reciprocate that she
Yes.
asks you a question and you answer, and she sort of proves to you that she's listening, and then you ask her a question in return. There's a lot of a reciprocation of authenticity going on. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's interesting is we just described a series of skills that when you use them with your wife and your wife uses them with you, feels very intuitive to you. You don't even think of them as skills. It just feels very natural. But what super communicators have recognized, and there are these people who can be consistent super communicators who can not only connect with their wives, they can connect with everyone. And it's not because they're more of an extrovert or more charming. It's because they've recognized that what you do with your wife is a set of skills, and that once you recognize them as skills, you can actually use them with anyone, right? You can have that same kind of conversation, ask those same kinds of questions, prove that you're listening, reciprocate. You can do that with the people you work with the other parents you see at morning pickup, with a stranger on the bus. Communication is just about recognizing what skills allow us to connect with others, and then leaning into those skills, practicing them until they become habits. And that's what makes a super communicator a super communicator.
Do you think that people are kind of naturally in tune to do this? Because I feel as though, like, let's say, for example, like I have a podcast, I'm a public speaker. People view me as extroverted and good at this. But the reality is, if I'm in a room full of strangers, I'm very quiet. Like, I don't say a lot.
Yeah.
And I have this natural inclination to not ask a lot of questions or engage. Are there like specific people who, I mean, obviously people who are charismatic and naturally outgoing. I mean, it seems like an advantage, but for those of us who don't, let's say, have that natural inclination, like what are those skills that we can practice to engage better?
Absolutely. And let me just say there's been a lot of studies looking at, are certain personality characteristics more conducive to being a super communicator, and the answer is no. So
Hmm.
so the fact that you're good at asking questions is because you've practiced asking questions. And you could be an introvert or an extrovert, you could be charming or you could be curmudgeonly. That wouldn't matter. What matters is understanding that asking questions is useful and practicing asking questions, and a particular type of question known as a deep question. So one of the things that we know about consistent super communicators is that they tend to ask more questions than the average person, like 10 to 20 times as many questions.
Wow.
And some of those questions are just normal questions that are designed to invite you into a conversation, like, oh, what'd you think about that? Or what'd you say next? But some of the questions that they can ask very easily are what are known as deep questions. And deep questions are special because they ask us or invite us to talk about our values and our beliefs and our experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, right? Like you have to ask these deep questions, but it's actually very, very easy and straightforward. Like if you bump into someone and you ask them, what do you do for a living? And they say, oh, I'm a doctor. The most natural follow-up question is like, oh, where do you practice medicine? But a deep question would be to say, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Or
Hmm.
what do you like being a doctor? Like, what do you love about it? When we ask that question, the deep question, it doesn't feel overly probing or intimate. It's not hard to ask. But what it does is it invites the other person to tell us about who they really are. They tell us, oh, actually I decided to go to medical school because I saw my dad get sick and I saw the doctors help him and it was so inspiring to me. When someone answers a question that way, suddenly I know all these things about him. I know that his family is really important to him. I know that he's had these experiences as a kid, that helping others is an important part of how this person sees their life. Asking deep questions is really, really easy once we get into the habit of it, once we start looking for the opportunities. And it's a really important skill that super communicators have, because what it does is it invites the other person to say something real and meaningful.
Mm. Yeah, I was going to ask about this idea of being vulnerable in a conversation because I feel as
Yeah.
though the best kind of discussions I've had with people tend to be ones where we do go deep. We do kind of share more of ourselves than just a shallow conversation would offer. Is that required? Do we have to kind of like spill our darkest secrets to have a good
Not at
conversation? Like,
all.
what does that look like?
Not at all. So vulnerability is a really important thing in conversation and in life, but sometimes people misunderstand what vulnerability is. They think of vulnerability as exactly like, I need to be crying to be vulnerable. But that's not actually right. What vulnerability is that when I say something that you could judge me for, it feels vulnerable. Now, so for instance, if I was to say to you, you know, I like Star Trek a lot more than Star Wars. I realize that's controversial, but I think Star Trek's superior to Star Wars. Now, the truth of the matter is, you might not have an opinion about that. And even if you did, I might not care what your opinion is. But the act of saying something that you could judge, to say like only jerks like Star Trek more than Star Wars, the fact that I'm saying something that you could judge, that is where the vulnerability comes from. And so when you say something like, you know, I became a doctor because I saw my dad get sick, that's a vulnerable statement because I could judge you for that. Or if I said, you know, actually, like I went to law school because like I thought that the system wasn't working right for the people I care about. I don't care what your judgment is about that, but the act of saying it, of revealing something important about myself, that is the vulnerable admission. And when there's hardwired into our brain is this instinct that when we hear vulnerability, we listen to it very closely. And if we reciprocate that vulnerability, if I say, I like Star Trek better than Star Wars, and you say, actually, that's interesting because I like hot dogs better than hamburgers, that act of reciprocating the authenticity, it makes us like and trust each other more. We're almost powerless against it. That doesn't mean we're going to be best friends. It doesn't mean that we're going to agree with each other, but it does mean that we feel like we're being honest with each other. And that honesty creates a sense of closeness.
I mean, on that topic, one thing I have heard for years, you know, as a podcaster, I tend to share a lot of pre-recorded information, right? So I have the chance to re-record what I do. And one thing I was told way back in the beginning was not to do that, to like let my flaws show up on the show on purpose, because then listeners would have a better connection because they would know like the human side of me as opposed to the polished side. And I feel like there's something about that that's much more personal, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that we know, like think back to like great conversations you've had, right? Conversations you've walked away just feeling wonderful afterwards. If I showed you a transcript of that conversation, what you would see is that it looks like a mess, right? You and the people you're talking to, you're interrupting each other. You're starting some idea and then getting distracted and talking about some other idea. You're saying something and like your sentence is kind of jarbled because the point of a conversation is not to sound polished and precise. It's not to impress the other person how smart you are. The point of a conversation is to experience the conversation, to be in the moment. And when we are in the moment, things don't look polished. They don't look perfect, but we don't notice. We don't even notice in that moment. One of the things that's really powerful is that if you ask people to describe conversations they've had, particularly meaningful conversations, they almost can never remember exactly what was said. They remember the topic and they remember that like this one idea came up and I said this thing and this other person said this thing, but they can't remember really the flow of the conversation, what specifically was said, but they always remember how they felt during that conversation. And that's what's important, is that when we're having a real conversation, the reason why our words aren't polished and perfect is because we're not focused on our words. We're focused on how we feel and how the other person feels, and on picking up on all those cues that tell us either this person is understanding what I'm saying or they're not understanding what I'm saying.
So we're really, in that sense, are we trying to get to like just an emotional connection? Is that kind of the driver behind this?
So there's three kinds of conversations, and I should sort of explain where this book came from. I started working on this when I got into this bad pattern with my wife, which many people listening will recognize from their own lives. Like I would come home from work after a tough day and I'd start complaining about my day. And my wife would offer me this really good advice. She would say something like, why don't you go and take your boss to lunch and you guys can get to know each other? And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset. And I would say like, you're supposed to be supporting me. Why aren't you outraged on my behalf? And then she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And so as a reporter, I went to all these researchers and I said like, this happens all the time in every relationship. Like what's going on here? And they said, well, look, here's the thing that we figured out in the last decade as we've learned more about communication. what we found is that we tend to go into a discussion assuming it's about one thing, right? We're talking about my day, or we're talking about our kids' grades, or where we're going to go on vacation. But actually, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And those kinds of conversations, they tend to fall into one of three big buckets. There are these practical conversations where we're making plans together or we're solving problems. But then there's emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then finally, there's these social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and to society and the social identities that are important to us. And they said, what we found is that all three conversations are totally legitimate. But if you're not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, then you can't really hear each other. And that's, of course, what was happening with my wife and me, right? I was having an emotional conversation and she was having a practical conversation. And they're both equally legitimate conversations, but they were different kinds of conversations. And so we had trouble connecting with each other. And this has become known within psychology as the matching principle, that successful communication requires having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, which means I have to learn to figure out what kind of mindset you're in, what kind of conversation you want to have and match you. And I also have to know how to invite you to match me, because it's not all about you. It's about us coming together and choosing a conversation together.
Part of what I'm hearing here, which maybe this is kind of the subtext of what you're talking about, is that for this matching principle to take place, like I have to be engaged in the conversation. I have to be like paying attention,
Absolutely.
listening for what's happening. In other words, like I can't just be lazy when I approach the conversation, because I feel like, well, this interview here, like I'm listening to your words very closely because I want to ask great questions. But in my average day-to-day life, like I'm distracted, I'm doing 1,000 things. Like, how do we, like, are we trying really hard to say, like, okay, this is an important conversation. I want to show up fully and engage. Does it require that level of activity there?
So what's interesting is that actually listening is a very, very easy activity if we're in the right environment. So when you're watching, a Netflix show and it's engaging to you, it's not hard for you to listen to the show and follow along, right? When someone's telling you a funny story, it doesn't feel like work to listen to someone telling the story, because it's interesting and it's compelling. It draws you in. Now, if you were in a situation where you're watching a Netflix show and your kids are screaming in the background and the house is on fire, then it would be sort of hard to listen, right? And similarly, when we're talking to a friend and we have a phone in our pocket that keeps buzzing and there's a TV over their shoulder and the game's playing and we keep looking at it, or more importantly, if we're coming into a conversation and instead of listening, we're thinking about what we want to say. If we're saying to ourselves, this is a budget discussion and Jim's droning on, but what I really want to convince him of is that he has to increase my budget by 10%. Then it is hard to listen. But that's not because listening is hard. That's because we're not creating the environment that allows us to listen easily. And so oftentimes what we have to do is be in an environment where it's conducive to listening. Don't try and watch Netflix when the house is on fire and the kids are screaming. But secondly, go into that conversation with the right goal in mind. And the right goal in mind is not to sound polished and sound perfect and make sure that, you all understand my idea and you agree with me. The right mindset for a conversation is to say, look, the only goal of this conversation, it is not to convince you I am right and you're wrong. It's not to convince you to like me. It's not going to convince you that I'm smart. My only goal in this conversation is to understand how you see the world and speak in such a way that you can understand how I see the world. If I do that and we walk away and we still disagree with each other, then the conversation has been a complete success. And when we go in with that intention, listening becomes very, very easy because we've evolved to be great listeners. We just have to create an environment where our brain's instincts can take over.
I want to go back to that point you made earlier about, talking to your wife. I feel like this is very common for me, and maybe it's common for men as well. I want to solve a problem in the moment. So if my wife brings me her day and says, here are all the bad things that happened today, I want to fix the problems, but she wants to have like an emotional connection and just wants to kind of like spill her guts. And I need to somehow figure out, I guess, the skill set here of switching, to your point here of not being just practical, but being more emotional and making that pivot in the moment to recognize what she needs now and to be on her, like in that conversation that she's having, not the one I want to have. Yeah. I feel like that for me is, by the way, ongoing.
That doesn't mean that you can't have the conversation you want to have also. It just means that you have to be having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. So let's say your wife comes to you and she's talking about her day and How do you figure out if she wants you to solve this problem or if she wants to vent and have an emotional conversation? Well, I'll tell you what my wife does. She just asks me. She says, like, look, do you want me to come up with solutions for you, or do you just need to like complain and get this off your chest? And actually, I love it when she asks that. I say, like, no, it's not that big a deal. I'm just venting because, like, I feel like I need to vent. And then I might vent for a little while, and then she'll often say, okay, I totally understand how you feel. It feels really like you've had a rough day. Some solutions occur to me. Could we talk about ways to solve this problem? So in that case, what she's doing is she's asking my permission to change the conversation we're having from an emotional conversation to a practical conversation, because that's what she wants to talk about. And what's important there is you'll notice she was asking questions. So those deep questions I mentioned, if your wife comes home and she's complaining about something, and it's our instinct to be like, okay, what you want to do is you want to go out there and you want to tell that guy at the automotive shop X and Y and Z. If before we start giving advice or instructions, if we just ask a question and say something like, this sounds like it's really frustrating to you. Why do you think it's so frustrating? Like obviously there's a solution here, but why does it seems like this bothered you? Like, what's going on? What they're going to do is they're going to tell you what kind of frame of mind they're in and what they're looking for. Because your wife might say, oh, it was really frustrating because I just didn't know what to say next. I need to figure out what to tell the guy. And that means she's in a practical mindset. Or she might say, it's really frustrating because I'm paying this guy and he's supposed to be polite to me and he's being a jerk. So that's more of a much more emotional or maybe even a social frame of mind. When we ask a question and ask a deep question, when we ask people not about the facts of their life, but how they feel about their life, they tell us what kind of conversation they want to have right now.
Yeah, I like this idea of being more involved with that matching idea. And I think of this from the framework of I want to your point of the book, make a stronger connection with people. I want to be able to get to a point where we're on the same plane. And I tend to feel I approach my life from my lens all the time. And to be able to see it through the lens of somebody else, I mean, to your point earlier, it requires empathy. It requires having a connection that's beyond me. And I think it's more of a social experience as opposed to a what do I get from this kind of perspective.
Yes.
Take the ego out of it for a second and ask better questions.
That's exactly right. And let's talk about what happens after we ask that question, because asking the question is just the first step to becoming a super communicator. What often happens next is your wife is going to answer that question and you need to prove to her that you've been listening. Now, oftentimes we just do that just by saying I'm sorry to hear that and showing that we've been paying attention. But in some conversations, particularly conflict conversations where we disagree about something, where we're talking about something really serious, where I might have to give you some bad news, maybe a performance review that isn't positive. In those situations, there's always a suspicion in each person's head that the other person isn't actually listening to them. They're just waiting their turn to speak. And so one of the things that we can do after asking a deep question is we prove that we're listening. And there's actually a technique for this known as looping for understanding that they teach at Harvard and Stanford, a bunch of other fancy places. What they teach you is that there's 3 steps here. So the first step is you ask that question, right? Preferably a deep question. And then when the person finishes answering the question, step 2 is repeat back in your own words what you just heard them say. But what's important here is don't mimic them. The goal here is not mimicry. The goal here is to prove that I was paying attention, and more importantly, to prove that I'm processing it. So saying something like, what I hear you say is that you're upset because this guy at the automotive shop ignored you. And it sounds like actually you feel like maybe he's ripping you off because he's ignoring you and he's not giving you the respect you deserve. And as a woman in an automotive shop, I know that could be really frustrating. Right? So I'm repeating back and showing you that I heard you and that I'm processing what you said. And then step 3, and this is the one we usually forget, ask if you got it right. Because one of 2 things will happen. The first thing is I'll say, did I get it right? And the other person will say, no, you didn't totally understand. And that's useful to know. Or the second thing that happens is they say, yeah, I think you understood what I was trying to say. And at that moment, what's happened is I have asked them for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And when you acknowledge that I was listening to you, you become more likely to listen to me. So that's the second step, is proving that we're listening.
No, I love that. I think that's one thing I don't do well. I'm hearing like, okay, I need to work on that issue in terms of really being in the moment. Because my wife constantly will ask me in a conversation, are you listening to me right now? And I have to catch
Right.
myself and be like, oh wait, I really wasn't paying attention. I really wasn't engaged, and she caught me on it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. But if you set a goal for yourself of, I'm going to repeat back what she's saying to me right now, and I'm going to show her in my own words, right? I'm going to show her that I'm listening. It's going to be much easier for you to listen, right? Like now your goal in your head is not to come up with counter arguments or advice. Your goal in your head is to really pay attention. And that's going to make it much easier to pay attention. Yeah, the third step is that we want to show the other person that we want to connect with them, right? And this is a little bit more ephemeral and a little bit more challenging, but we want to show them that we understand what kind of conversation is happening and that we want to connect with them. So sometimes that's as simple as saying like, look, it seems like this is something that's like a really an emotional issue for you, and like let's talk about that. Like I want to understand like why this upset you so much. Sometimes it's a matter of saying like, it I hear what you're saying, and let me just thank you for telling me about this, because this is like a really funny story, or this is something I enjoy hearing, or just laughing at the story. Laughter is a good example, because when we laugh, according to studies, about 80% of the time, we're not laughing in response to anything funny. We're laughing to show the other person we want to connect with them. And when they laugh back, they're showing us that they want to connect back with us. And so that's the third step, is find some way to let the other person know that you want to connect with them, that you're either paying attention because you take this seriously, because you hear what they're saying, because you understand what kind of conversation is occurring and you want to match them, or just to show them that you support them and that this is something that you want to understand. And that makes them more likely to want to understand you in return.
I mean, laughter may be a good example of kind of this other point that I was considering is, well, what about like nonverbal communication? Is this an opportunity for us to also connect in a way that we can like physically show that we're listening and engaged?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that happens is that when we're in a conversation with someone, a good conversation, our bodies actually start to automatically match each other. So in this conversation, you and I are separated by hundreds or thousands of miles, and we can't see each other. But actually, without us realizing it, our breath patterns have started to match, and our heart rate has started to match. And my guess is, depending on the light in the room that you're in, our pupils have begun dilating at a similar rate.
Wow.
And almost automatically, if we were sitting face to face, we would start using similar gestures, right? Neither of us would notice it. And more importantly, inside our brains, our thoughts, our neural activity is starting to look more and more similar. And that actually makes sense when you think about it, because if I tell you about an emotion I'm feeling, you actually experience that emotion a little bit, right? Or if I tell you about an idea that I've had, you actually experience that idea a little bit. And so the fact that our brains would start to look similar is not completely surprising. But what studies have shown is that the more and more similar our brains become, what's known as neural entrainment within neuroscience, the better we understand each other, the easier it is for me to understand what you're saying and vice versa. And so there's a lot of aspects of nonverbal communication that it's really helpful to lean into. Like if you feel an instinct to smile or laugh, you should definitely smile or laugh. If you find yourself having similar gestures to the person you're talking to, you shouldn't worry about that. That's actually a sign that you guys are aligning with each other. The goal of a conversation is to achieve this neural entrainment. And the more that we allow that to happen, and it's a very natural response, the closer we feel to each other and the better we understand each other.
I mean, I've heard something similar in the idea that we'd want to almost mirror the other person on purpose. Is that the intention here, or is this like just a natural reflex?
It's a natural reflex. And the problem with trying to mirror the other person on purpose is that that can become mimicry, and it feels kind of artificial, right? We've all had that experience. Like you go to buy a car and the salesman like forces you to shake their hand, and then like you nod and they nod, and you like sigh and they sigh. It doesn't feel authentic, right? Mimicry is not the goal here. The goal is to have an honest and authentic matching. And oftentimes that's something that we know how to do very intuitively. We just have to get out of our way and let it happen. So, if I laugh in this conversation, it's very natural for you to laugh in response, right? And is that mimicry? No, it's just kind of how conversation works. But it's also a way of us signaling to each other that we want to connect with each other.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I do find myself laughing a lot in conversations that seems almost inappropriate, but I just tend to do it because it just feels like I should do it. It just feels natural to do it then, so it's funny.
Exactly. And listening to that natural instinct, listening to that impulse is really, really important. Because again, if you think about it, communication is Homo sapiens' superpower, right? The reason our species has succeeded so well is because we can communicate. And as a result, our brains have evolved to be really good at communication, to have all these instincts like laughing that allow us to communicate with each other very easily. And so part of the goal here is to let those instincts out and take over. And it's hard in contemporary life, right? Because of technology, because we're communicating in different ways, because we can be distracted all the time, because like we have all these pictures in our head of what the perfect conversation is supposed to be like. And oftentimes it does look perfect. It doesn't look like messy like real conversations are. But if we can set all those things aside and we can let those instincts out, our brains know how to communicate really, really well. We just have to let them.
I mean, on that, you just mentioned technology. I feel like there is such a ginormous obstacle that it presents for this kind of connection you're talking about. Because I feel as though we're going to have these best experiences face to face. Like, how do we mirror that in the technology world? I mean, we're doing a virtual call right now. Like, how do we bring the same skill set to through the technology, or is it a different way of operating there?
No, absolutely the same skill set. And it's just understanding that different forms of communication have slightly different rules. And we know these usually, but sometimes we're moving so fast that we forget it. So one of my favorite examples of this is that about 100 years ago, when telephones first became popular, there were all these people who said, you'll never have a real conversation over a phone, right? Up to that moment, all conversations had happened face to face. And they said, look, if you can't see the other person, you're never going to really be able to communicate with them. And what's interesting is that at that moment, they were actually right. If you look at the transcripts from early phone conversations, basically using them as telegrams, they would like call up and they would give like a grocery order or stock order, and they didn't know how to have a conversation over a phone. Now, of course, by the time you and I and everyone who's listening, by the time we're in middle school, we can have like 7-hour conversations on the phone, and they feel like the most important conversations of our life. Yep. And that's because we learned how to use telephones. And what's interesting is we learned that there's certain rules for phones, that rules that like are so ingrained in us that we don't even recognize them as rules. When we're talking on the phone, including on this call, we tend to over enunciate our words by about 20%. We tend to put about a third more emotion into our voice because we know that the other person can't see us. We have learned how to use telephones as well as we've learned how to communicate face to face. And that doesn't mean that they're exactly the same, right? Some kind of conversations are better face to face than they are over the phone, but we know the differences there. We know when a conversation would be better face to face and when it's better over the phone. Now, in the last 15 years, all these new forms of communication have emerged. Email, text messages, emojis, Slack, the Snapchat, all these different things. And oftentimes when we get into trouble is when we forget that there are slightly different rules for different forms of communication. If I'm going to give you a piece of news, it's going to come across differently if I do it over text than if I do it over email, than if I do it over a phone call, than if I do it face to face. That doesn't mean that I can only give it to you face to face, but it means that if I'm doing it in those other formats, I need to be conscious of how the rules change. And I need to be conscious of strengths and weaknesses, that actually giving you a piece of hard news might be a lot easier over email than over text. Because in text, we tend to use these very short sentences, whereas in email, I can take the time to explain. And so technology is not bad. Technology does not destroy or change how we communicate. Rather, what it does is it offers new situations, new channels, and we have to think a little bit about how is this channel different from other channels.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely bring a different skill set to every one of these platforms you're talking about, and I tend to have, my preferences for certain forms. I mean, email is always my preferred method, but I think that to the point I was making, early on in the conversation today, is that when I walk into a room full of strangers, I'm not going to email them face to face. I still find this sense of, let's just kind of take this back to that origin point of people who are struggling with this and want to really like take this to the next level. How can we like take a practical action step today to improve conversations when we know like we need to improve in those moments?
Okay, so here I'm going to give you an assignment for you and for everyone listening. Okay, the next time you go into one of those parties where usually you say like, I'm really outgoing and I'm on my podcast, but at a party I'm kind of quiet in the corner. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to find someone, and your assignment is within 3 questions. I want you to ask them 3 questions. Within 3 questions, I want you to ask a deep question that gets to hopes and dreams. And that sounds really hard, right? That sounds like a big lift, but actually it'll probably only take you 2 questions. Because what you're probably going to do is you're going to go talk to someone and you're going to say, oh, what do you do for a living? And they're going to say, I'm an accountant. And you're going to say, oh, did you always want to be an accountant? Like, was that your dream as a kid? And they're going to say, no, of course not. Nobody dreams of being an accountant when they're a kid. But I love it because it's like a good, steady job. You've gotten to a deep question about hopes and dreams within 2 questions. And if you do that once at a party, twice at a party, 3 times at a party, by the time you do it the 3rd time, you'll do it automatically. It will be a habit. You won't even have to think about it. And when you ask someone about their hopes and dreams, when you ask them about why they enjoy living in the heights or in the valley, when you ask them, did you always dream of becoming a doctor or what was it like to go to high school over there? When you ask them about who they are, they will say, they will be engaged. They will love to talk to you. And what's really interesting is it'll be really easy for you to reciprocate because they'll say, oh, I became a doctor because I saw my dad get sick. And you'll say something like, oh, that's funny. I became a lawyer because I saw, one of my cousins get arrested as a kid. And I thought it was really unfair. When we ask these deep questions, we set ourselves up for success. And so this is my assignment to you and anyone who's listening. Just practice it. Practice it. Set yourself a goal of doing it once or twice at a party. And you will find that by the end of that party, you are doing it automatically. You are doing it without thinking about it. And then you're on the road to becoming a super communicator. Then you're on the road to treating everyone that you bump into the same way you treat your wife. And you'll be able to connect with them.
I love it. That is a perfect challenge for me personally, as well as everyone listening today. That's an awesome thing to work on. Charles, this has been fantastic. I'm very excited for your book to be out here and for our listeners to get a copy of it. So where can they learn more about you and get the book?
Absolutely. So you can buy a book anywhere you buy books, on Amazon or your local independent bookseller, which is always a great place to buy it, or Audible if you like listening to audiobooks. Audible is actually having, we've sold more copies of the book on Audible than on any other platform. And I narrate it myself, which was really fun. And if you want to learn about me and reach out to me, if you literally just Google my name, Charles Duhigg, I'm the only one on earth. Or if you Google Power of Habit, which is the first book I wrote, or Supercommunicators, my website will come up. My email address is on my website. I read and respond to every email I get from a reader. So I would invite people to find me, or on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and I'd love to engage with you and love to hear what you think about the book.
Love it. That is awesome. I'll be sure to have those links available for our listeners in the show notes page. And Charles, this was fantastic. I'm excited to go dig deeper into my conversations going forward. And this has been really helpful. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And for the action step this week, take the Charles Challenge. If you're anything like me and you need a little help asking great questions to engage in a great conversation, then let's take Charles up on his offer. Find someone you don't know, either at an event, at work, or out in the community, and get to a deeper conversation in just 3 questions or less. It may sound tough, but remember that this is a skill and you can improve it today. Now be sure to subscribe to this podcast in your favorite podcast app, or become a VIP member of the 5 a.m. Miracle community by getting the premium ad-free version with exclusive bonus episodes at 5ammiraclepremium.com. That's all I've got for you here on the 5 a.m. Miracle podcast this week. Until next time, you have the power to change your life, and the fun begins right and early.